Clerks logged capture risk as a category. Instructors copied the line into notebooks. A stores officer stamped issue requisitions daily. A runner carried folders between locked offices. Filing cabinets held thin carbon duplicates. Carbon ink smudged on fingertips and cuffs. A quartermaster checked kit lists by lamplight. Kit lists named small tools without detail. One line read knife lapel concealed. A typed memo asked for silent withdrawal. An engineer underlined silent in pencil. Yet he added no rattle under movement. Movement meant walking, sitting, crouching, running. A tailor measured lapel roll with chalk. Chalk marks followed the jacket's natural fold. The fold determined where thickness showed. Thickness showed first near the button line. A fitter pressed cloth between finger and thumb. He felt corners through wool and lining. He rejected any sharp corner profile. Rejected parts went into a red tray. The tray label carried a batch number. Their batch numbers matched a ledger column. Ledger columns tracked acceptance and rework. Rework was counted in minutes, not opinions. Minutes were initialed by a foreman. The foreman used a grease-stained stamp. The stamp left an oval mark. The mark triggered the next inspection step. Inspection used a simple go gauge. The gauge checked maximum thickness quickly. Any jam at entry meant failure. A file removed high spots on handles. Filing created swarf on the bench. That swarf stuck to oily sleeves and aprons. A worker brushed swarf into a tin. The tin was emptied at shift end. Shift end was marked on a wall clock. The clock ticked over the machine noise. Noise forced inspectors into a side room. Side room tests were done in quiet. Quiet tests listened for sheath scrape. Scrape meant friction on withdrawal. Friction meant delayed access under restraint. Restraint scenarios were written as drills. Drills were read from printed cards. The cards were laminated when materials allowed. Lamination sometimes failed during humid storage. Humidity softened glue and warped edges. Warped cards curled and caught in pockets. Pockets were cut from lining offcuts. Offcuts were sorted by cloth weight. Cloth weight changed concealment performance. A heavier lining hid bulges better. A lighter lining printed under bright lighting. Lighting mattered in station searches. Training rooms used mirrors and overhead bulbs. Bulbs highlighted any lapel distortion. Distortion looked like bad tailoring. Bad tailoring attracted second looks. Second looks turned into hand checks. Hand checks searched for hard shapes. Hard shapes were minimized by radiusing. Radiusing was checked by touch and sight. Sight checks used a small inspection lamp. Lamp glare exposed shiny metal finishes. Shiny finishes were dulled by abrasion. Abrasion used fine emery strips, emery grit lodged in fingernail beds. The hands were washed in cold basins. Cold water did not remove oil fully. Residual oil stained paper forms. Forms carried official letterheads and codes. Codes were kept consistent across departments. Consistency avoided confusion in requisition routing. Routing used internal mail pouches. Pouches were sealed with twine and tags. Tags showed date and destination office. An office clerk signed for the pouch. The signature went into a receipt book. Receipt books filled quickly during peak periods. Their peak periods aligned with planned insertions. Insertions required full kit readiness checks. Readiness checks were ticked on clipboards. Clipboards carried checklists with item codes. Item codes were not descriptive by design. Non-descriptive codes reduced obviousness if captured. Captured paperwork was treated as exposure risk. Exposure risk drove strict destruction procedures. Destruction relied on fire, water, dispersal. The lapel knife supported seam opening tasks, and seam opening removed hidden packets quickly. Packets were placed behind lapel facings. Facings were stiffened with interfacing strips. Interfacing hid thin objects better. Interfacing also resisted pocket stitching pull-out. Pull-out happened during running and grappling. Grappling was simulated in controlled drills. Controlled drills were timed and recorded. Timing was noted beside each participant name. Names were sometimes replaced with numbers. Numbers reduced identifiable training records. Records were still kept for competence tracking. Tracking used pass, repeat, remedial categories. Remedial sessions focused on safe handling. Safe handling reduced accidental cuts. Accidental cuts left blood on cuffs. Blood on cuffs required laundering access. Laundry access was not guaranteed in transit. Transit meant trains, buses, safe houses. Safe houses had limited spare clothing. Spare clothing was logged in cupboards. Cupboards had padlocks and key registers. The key registers used signatures and times. Time entries showed who accessed supplies. Access logs discouraged casual rummaging. Rummaging increased miscounts and missing tools. Missing tools triggered written incident reports. Reports used neutral phrasing and dates. Dates were sometimes omitted for security. Omitted dates complicate later reconstruction. Reconstruction relies on surviving fragments and examples. Examples show compact fixed blade solutions. Fixed blades simplified manufacturing and inspection. Folding blades introduced springs and pivots. Pivots attracted grit and seized. Seized pivots failed under urgent use. Urgent use was framed as restraint cutting. Restraints included cord, cloth, and tape. Metal cuffs were outside the knife's scope. Scopes were written as equipment limitations. Limitations were taught to reduce misuse. Misuse included prying and twisting. Twisting snapped tips on small blades. And snapped tips created sharp fragments. Fragments cut fabric and skin unpredictably. Unpredictable cuts ruined concealment stitching. Stitching repairs required needles and thread. Needles were carried in small repair kits. Repair kits were issued with receipts sometimes. Receipts were discouraged in deep cover rolls. Deep cover relied on minimal trace items. Minimal trace still needed practical tools. Tool lists balanced utility and deniability. A deniability included plausible household explanations. Household explanations avoided explicit weapon terminology. Terminology choices appeared in memo drafts. Drafts were edited by security officers. Security officers crossed out suggestive words. They replaced them with neutral nouns. Neutral nouns still required clear internal meaning. Internal meaning was maintained by code lists. Code lists were kept in locked drawers. Drawers were opened only when needed. The need drove repeated reference during issuing. Issuing occurred at stores, counters, and rooms. Rooms had shelves, bins, and labels. Labels were sometimes handwritten in pencil. Pencil smears showed handling frequency. Frequently handled bins held common items. The lapel knife bin was not large. Small bin size suggested controlled distribution. Controlled distribution reduced loss rates. Loss rates were tracked by quarterly summaries. Summaries listed missing items by category. Categories included knives, compasses, radios, papers. Papers were always treated as high sensitivity. Knives were treated as functional support items. Support items still demanded concealment discipline. Discipline was trained through repetition and correction. Correction used brief instructions, not lectures. An instructor demonstrated lapel pocket access. His hands moved slowly for visibility. Visibility mattered under classroom conditions. Some classroom conditions never matched detention reality. Reality was modeled only in constraints. Constraints included limited movement and poor lighting. Poor lighting forced tactile identification. Tactile identification required predictable orientation. Orientation was controlled by pocket design. Pocket design used loops, tabs, and stitching. Loops held the sheath in fixed position. Tabs prevented downward migration during walking. Migration created bulges near the chest. The chest bulges were visible under thin shirts. Thin shirts were common in warm climates. Warm climates increased sweat and corrosion. Corrosion risk required oiling routines. Oiling routines were printed in tiny leaflets. Leaflets were folded and tucked into kits. Kits were wrapped in brown paper. Brown paper tore under repeated handling. Tiers exposed contents during transit checks. Transit checks occurred at depots and drop points. Drop points recorded arrivals in notebooks. The notebooks used shorthand and minimal details. Minimal detail still included item counts. Counts were verified against manifests. Manifests were typed and duplicated. Duplication used carbon sheets that slipped. Slipped carbons created partial unreadable lines. Unreadable lines caused arguments over quantities. Arguments produced fresh queries to headquarters. Queries travelled by courier and cable channels. Channel load was a planning consideration. Some planners discouraged avoidable follow-up signals. Avoidable signals meant fewer last-minute requests. Thus, caches were stocked ahead when possible. Stocking ahead required forecasting mission profiles. Profiles changed with geography and cover rolls. Cover rolls changed wardrobe requirements. Wardrobe requirements affected lapel geometry. Geometry included lapel width and roll. Roll depended on pressing and interfacing. Pressing quality varied by civilian tailor. The civilian tailor work could not be guaranteed. Guarantees were impossible under war conditions. Thus, internal pockets were reinforced beyond normal. Reinforcement used extra stitches in hidden rows. Hidden rows were checked by pulling tests. Pulling tests used spring scales sometimes. Scales measured stitch failure thresholds. Thresholds were compared to movement loads. Loads were estimated from running and grappling. Estimations were rough and context-dependent. Context dependence was noted in margin comments. Comments were signed with initials only. Initials protected staff identities in files. Files still carried classification markings. Markings determined storage and access controls. Access controls used locked cabinets and logs. Logs contained dates and staff numbers. Staff numbers were checked at entry points. Entry points had guards and passes. Passes were paper with photographs. Photographs were stamped and sometimes replaced. Their replacement requests created more paperwork load. Paperwork load competed with engineering time. Engineering time was scarce under production quotas. Quotas were posted as weekly targets. Targets drove faster finishing and higher rejects. Rejects were recorded on inspection sheets. Sheets listed failure modes like Burrs. Burrs cut sheath linings during insertion. Lining damage created loose fibers. Loose fibers trapped moisture and grit. Moisture and grit accelerated edge wear. But wear reduced cutting efficiency on tape. Tape required clean slicing to avoid tearing. Tearing increased time and attention. Attention during detention was treated as risk. Risk was never reduced to zero. Zero risk language did not appear in notes. Notes used cautious verbs and conditional phrases. Conditional phrasing protected against false certainty. False certainty produced dangerous over-reliance. Over-reliance on a knife was discouraged. Discouragement appeared as brief warnings. Warnings were issued as general guidance. Guidance emphasized layered planning and discipline. Discipline included not touching the lapel. Touching the lapel looked like checking. Checking looked like nervous adjustment. Adjustment drew watchers' attention. Attention led to scrutiny and searches. Searches began with outerwear removal often. Removal exposed lapel interiors and seams. Seams were built to look ordinary. Ordinary appearance required matching thread color. Matching thread color required access to supplies. Supplies were rationed and tracked by tickets. Tickets were filed for audit purposes. Audits checked usage against allocations. Allocations were influenced by ministerial priorities. Priorities favored major weapons and radios. Small knives received lower-grade steel sometimes. Lower-grade steel required careful heat treatment. Heat treatment depended on furnace control. Small shops used batch furnaces and oil quench. Oil quench produced smoke and residue. Residue required wiping and solvent cleaning. Solvents were restricted and signed out. Sign-out logs listed quantities and purposes. Purposes were written as brief descriptors. Descriptors avoided explicit clandestine terms. That avoidance created ambiguity in later readings. Later readings rely on surviving tool examples. Examples show compact blades and minimal handles. Handles had to be thin and smooth. Smoothness reduced snagging on cloth layers. Snagging tore linings and exposed pockets. Exposed pockets looked like secret compartments. Compartment appearance was avoided at all costs. Avoidance drove designers towards simple seams. Simple seams blended with garment construction. Construction details varied with suit style. Suit style changed with civilian fashion. Fashion drift forced flexible concealment methods. Flexibility was taught as principle-based instruction. Principles included using structural edges for support. Had support meant stitching into strong seam allowances. Allowance width differed among tailors. Tailors measured allowances with small rulers. Rulers were kept in sewing baskets and tins. Tins also held spare buttons. Buttons provided secondary anchor points. Anchor points prevented sheath slumping. Slumping moved the knife toward the jacket edge. Edge placement increased chance of visible outline. Outline visibility rose under directional light. Directional light existed in offices and stations. Stations used mirrors and polished floors. Polished floors reflected up into lapels. Reflections revealed any hard straight lines. Hard straight lines were disguised by placement angle. Placement angle was rehearsed before departures. Departures included final kit inspections. Inspections were performed with printed checklists. Checklists were initialed for accountability. Accountability created traceable responsibility chains. Chains mattered when items went missing. Missing items could compromise operational security. Security incidents triggered internal inquiries. Inquiries required statements and countersignatures. Countersignatures slowed routine issuing processes. Slow issuing forced last-minute substitutions. Substitutions created training inconsistencies. Inconsistencies were noted in instructor reports. Reports asked for standardized equipment sets. Standardization required procurement approvals. Approvals moved through committees and stores. And committees recorded minutes and action lists. Action lists included material sourcing tasks. Sourcing tasks were constrained by ration shortages. Shortages affected leather for sheaths. Leather was reserved for boots and straps. Alternate sheath materials were tested and rejected. Some fiber materials warped with moisture. Warped sheaths tightened around blades. Tight sheaths increased withdrawal force. Force increased time and noise. Noise discipline was part of acceptance criteria. Acceptance criteria were written in terse sentences. Sentences specified retention, silence, and concealment. Concealment was judged under worn clothing. Worn clothing included creases and stains. Stains were common under field conditions. Field conditions included rain, soot, and dust. Dust gathered in lapel folds and pockets. Dust made cloth abrasive against metal. Abrasive contact dulled edges over time. Edge maintenance used small stones or files. Stones were not always included in kits. Kits had strict weight and space limits. Space limits were more critical than weight. Space limits came from pocket availability. Pocket availability was limited under civilian cover. Cover demanded normal-looking clothing fit. Fit problems showed at shoulders and lapels. Fit problems could be spotted by police. Police attention increased requests for identification. Identification handling risked revealing forged documents. Document exposure was treated as critical. The knife supported document removal from linings. Removal required cutting stitches without outer damage. Outer damage looked like tampering. Tampering prompted deeper searches. Deeper searches included seam probing and pat-downs. Pat-downs found hard objects by pressure. Pressure detection required minimizing handle thickness. Thickness reduction reduced grip comfort. Comfort was treated as secondary in memos. Memos prioritized concealment and reliability. Reliability meant the blade stayed intact. Intactness required avoiding brittle heat treatment. Heat treatment variations caused chipping and rolling. Chipping happened on hard targets and wire. Wire cutting was not the knife's intended role. Yet field improvisation pushed knives into misuse. Misuse showed up in debrief questionnaires. Questionnaires asked about breakage and corrosion. Responses were brief, sometimes only a tick. Ticks were compiled into summary tallies. The tallies influenced subsequent procurement decisions. Decisions were debated in short internal notes. Notes compared alternative small tools. Alternatives included small scissors and wire cutters. Scissors were thicker and harder to conceal. Cutters required pivots and were heavier. The lapel knife remained favored for flatness. Flatness simplified pocket design and tailoring. Tailoring still required careful stitch tension. Tension errors caused puckering on cloth face. The puckering was visible even at a distance. Distance observation occurred in queues and checkpoints. Checkpoint lines forced slow waiting and inspection. Waiting encouraged fidgeting and clothing adjustments. Adjustments risked accidental exposure of the pocket. Pocket exposure could reveal stitching irregularities. Irregularities led to questions and delay. Delay disrupted planned travel timelines. Timelines were coordinated with contacts and couriers. Courier schedules depended on train timetables. Timetables changed with wartime disruptions. Disruptions forced rerouting and unscheduled stops. Unscheduled stops increased chance of random checks. Random checks made concealment quality more important. Quality was a function of workmanship and practice. Workmanship started in small workshops and benches. Benches held vices, stones and gauges. Gauges were hung on nails and hooks. Hooks kept tools visible to supervisors. And supervisors enforced process steps and sign-offs. Sign-offs were made in ink, not pencil. Ink entries were harder to dispute later. Disputes arose when acceptance rates fell. Falling acceptance prompted scrutiny of materials. Material scrutiny meant checking steel deliveries. Deliveries came with certificates and invoices. Invoices were stamped and filed by date. Date filing allowed quick audit trails. Audit trails were demanded by government finance. Finance departments asked for unit cost breakdowns. Breakdowns included labor, steel, and finishing. Finishing included deburring and surface dulling. Dulling took time and abrasive consumables. Consumables were rationed and reordered slowly. Slow orders created intermittent production pauses. Pauses were documented as awaiting materials. Awaiting materials notes affected delivery promises. Promises were stated in formal letters. Letters were copied and circulated internally. Circulation produced pressure on foremen. Foremen pressed workers to maintain output. Output pressure increased shortcut temptation. Shortcuts often skipped final burr inspection. Skipped inspection caused sheath cuts in use. Sheath cuts created loose stitching and noise. Noise during withdrawal was treated as failure. Failures were returned and tagged for analysis. Analysis involved examining wear marks and nicks. Nicks showed contact points inside sheaths. Contact points guided minor redesign changes. Changes were implemented through updated patterns. Patterns were pinned to cork boards. Boards held paper patterns and notes. Notes included pocket depth and seam lines. Depth had to secure the sheath fully. Full security prevented knife drop during movement. Drops produced audible impacts on hard floors. Floors included station tiles and office boards. Impact noise drew attention in quiet corridors. Attention again was the operational metric. A metric management relied on behavior discipline. Behavior discipline was trained alongside tool handling. Handling drills involved blind retrieval practice. Practice used stopwatches and recorded errors. Errors included grabbing cloth instead of sheath. Cloth grabs delayed access and tore seams. Torn seams required repair under unsafe conditions. Unsafe repairs risked visible stitching differences. Differences suggested hidden modifications. Hidden modifications were looked for in searches. Search training taught agents to expect seam probing. Probing focused on unnatural thickness zones. Zones were mapped during fitting sessions. Fitting sessions used chalk and mirrors. Mirrors showed lapel curvature under movement. Movement rehearsal included sitting in chairs. Chair backs compressed fabric and shifted pockets. Shifted pockets could rotate the sheath. Rotation altered retrieval orientation. Orientation errors caused fumbling and delay. Delay increased time under restraint. And time under restraint increased pressure for mistakes. Mistakes included cutting too close to skin. Skin cuts were recorded as medical incidents. Medical incidents produced paperwork and downtime. Downtime reduced training throughput. Throughput limits mattered when courses were crowded. Crowded courses reduced individual supervision time. Reduced supervision required simpler equipment designs. Simpler designs favored fixed blades and simple sheaths. Simple sheaths still needed stable retention. Retention methods included tight fit and loops. Loops were made from cloth strips and stitching. Strip edges were folded to prevent fraying. Fraying could protrude and be noticed. Noticed fraying invited closer garment inspection. Inspection could include inside lining checks. Inside checks threatened lapel concealment. Thus some designs moved pockets deeper. Deeper pockets reduced printing risk. Deeper pockets increased withdrawal distance. Distance increased time and cloth friction. Friction caused scrape noises in some fabrics. Fabric choice affected scrape magnitude. Wool masked noise better than thin cotton. Thin cotton was common in summer shirts. Shirt carry was a contingency method. Contingency methods were taught as optional steps. Optional steps were not always rehearsed enough. Insufficient rehearsal caused mistakes in real use. Real use reports were rare and fragmentary. Fragments still mentioned cutting bindings and seams. Seams included cuffs, collars, and lapels. The lapel seam cutting required precision and control. Control depended on grip and blade sharpness. Sharpness depended on steel hardness and maintenance. Maintenance required periodic oiling and wiping. Wiping used cloth squares from kits. Cloth squares were also used for cleaning radios. Radio cleaning competed with knife maintenance time. Time allocation was a constant field problem. Field problems were logged in debrief forms. Debrief forms were typed and filed. Filing created archives with gaps and redactions. Gaps prevent exact measurement confirmation. Measurements are therefore stated conservatively. Conservative phrasing appears in technical summaries. Summaries avoid claiming universal effectiveness. Effectiveness depends on search procedure and luck. Luck was never endorsed as a plan. Plans emphasize controllable variables instead. Variables included concealment quality and discipline. Quality began at the bench and sewing table. And at the sewing table, needles snapped sometimes. Snapped needles left broken tips in cloth. Broken tips could scratch the wearer. Scratches caused unconscious lapel touching. Touching again risked attention and scrutiny. Thus even needle jingle breakage mattered. Needle quality varied during wartime shortages. Shortages forced substitutions in many materials. Substitutions triggered new acceptance checks. Checks created delays in issuing schedules. Schedules were coordinated with operational timelines. The timelines were updated by typed amendments. Amendments were initialed and distributed. Distribution followed strict list routing. Routing ensured only necessary offices received copies. Copy control limited exposure if documents leaked. Leak risk shaped every administrative process. The lapel knife sat inside that system. It was a small object with heavy paperwork. Paperwork governed its manufacture, issue, and training. Training governed its safe practical use. The use was limited to cutting and seam work. That limitation was repeated in instructor notes. Notes were kept terse and procedural. Procedural language matched the equipment's purpose. Purpose was escape assistance through cutting tasks. Cutting tasks were narrow, measurable functions. Functions depended on concealment and silent access. Access depended on pockets, loops, and orientation. Orientation depended on careful tailoring and testing. Testing depended on checklists and inspection rooms. Inspection rooms depended on quiet, light, and time. Time depended on quotas, shortages, and approvals. Approvals depended on stamps, signatures, and routing. Routing depended on clerks, cabinets, and logs. Logs depended on ink, paper, and discipline. Discipline depended on training, repetition, and corrections. Corrections depended on instructors and recorded drills. Drills depended on stopwatches and scoring sheets. Sheets depended on legible entries and filing. Filing depended on orderly cabinets and control. Control depended on minimizing visible irregularities. Irregularities included bulges, puckers, and noise. Noise was assessed by listening and handling. Handling was taught through rehearsed motions. Motions were kept short to reduce slipping. Slipping was prevented by sharp edges. Sharp edges were protected by stable sheaths. Stable sheaths were built from scarce materials. Scarce materials were allocated by ration systems. And ration systems were documented with tickets and audits. Audits reinforced cautious phrasing and limited claims. Limited claims matched surviving fragmented evidence. The lapel knife remains a constrained design. Its history is observed through process traces. Process traces include swarf, chalk, stamps, and logs. Those traces explain the device without embellishment.